This is the Cameron Journal Podcast. It's a place where we talk about important things. It's a place where we bring a little slice of the news to you. It's a place where we do important things, have important conversations. It's also things that I like to talk about. My name is Cameron Cowan, and this is the Cameron Journal Podcast. Today on the Cameron Journal Podcast, I am very excited to be meeting someone new and interesting. Jesan Sorrells is with HSCT Publishing, and we're going to be talking about some leadership skills. We're going to talk about some organizational skills, talent, all this type of thing. It's another business-focused episode of the Cameron Journal Podcast. So welcome, Jesan, to the Cameron Journal Podcast.
Thank you for having me on, Cameron. I really do appreciate it. This is an awesome opportunity, and you're doing great work with the platform you are building.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So why don't we begin? Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and how you got into the leadership space and the publishing space?
Absolutely. So, I started out, about 10 years ago now, really looking around and thinking about how can I help people in organizations, small, medium, and large, engage with conflict better. And I did use those terms on purpose, engage with conflict better. And that's really where it began, right? Because conflict gets you into everything. People are in conflict. We see this at the nation-state level. We see this at the political level, all over the place. But we also see this at the interpersonal level. Whenever two people are attempting to achieve a project or achieve a goal, there's going to be conflict. There's going to be disagreements, disputes. There's going to be spirited debate. And in some cases, there's going to be hurt feelings. And so many people don't have an understanding of how to navigate that. And understanding that kernel of truth opened the door to me first becoming a consultant and then building out a leadership training and development company, and then moving into the space of publishing around leadership, management, talent development, and of course my perennial favorite, conflict and communication.
Fascinating. It's always interesting for me to see people who have the career that I wish I could have if I didn't do this. So this is interesting. So what do you think? Well, give us the top maybe 3 sources of interpersonal conflict in a business setting and some strategies to solve them, because this is actionable for people today. People listen to me a lot on their commute to work. So perhaps with some of your ideas, things might go better at the office for them as they're listening to this right now.
Sure. So if you are in the car, or if you are running on your treadmill, if you are walking right now, and if you are thinking about that bloodsucker of a boss, or those colleagues that don't like you, or about the last time you had to lead someone and they just said no to you and now you don't know what to do, here are some thoughts for you. Here are some actionable tips. Here are some ideas for you as you go into those situations. Tip number 1, know what you want. Many times, most people in conflict have no clear idea what they want. They have zero clarity. Well, when you don't know what you want out of a conflict, then you will get exactly what it is that the other party wants for you. It's just like the Cheshire Cat and Alice in Wonderland. Remember that old great story? Remember Alice went to the Cheshire Cat and said, I don't know which way to go. And the Cheshire Cat says to her, well, do you have an idea of where you want to go? And she said, no. And he said, well, then any way is a good way. It doesn't really matter. Know your motives, know what you want out of the negotiation, know what you want out of the interaction, know what you want out of the discussion. Have that firmly and clearly set in your mind. That's tip number one. Tip number two, engage with candor. Candor does not mean telling people the truth that's going to strip away their emotions, strip away their identity, or strip away their value as a human being. What candor means is telling people the thing that they need to hear in the moment that they need to hear it. This is based on intuition and relationship. If you don't have intuition and if you don't have a relationship, you cannot effectively be candid. And one of the main issues that we see in workplace conflicts is that people don't actually spend time trying to learn who the other party is. In a conflict, they really spend a lot of time putting that party in a box inside of their own head and making sure that that box is firmly shut so the other party doesn't get out. Candid. You want to be candid in your engagement. And then finally, you want to have the courage to actually engage in the negotiation process. Without clarity and without candor, you can't have courage. But with just only courage by itself, well, and no clarity and no candor, well, you will then run in where, as the old folks used to say back in the day, you will run in where angels fear to tread. Courage is the ability, it's the heart word, as Brene Brown said. It's the ability to go into a situation knowing that you might fail in the negotiation and doing it anyway. Because it's about building the relationship, it's about maintaining forward motion on the project, or it's about accomplishing a goal. Clarity, candor, and courage. Those are the top three ideas you can take with you to work and maybe have some success today after you get off that treadmill.
Absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. I think that also explains to me why I was always absolutely terrible at office politics. Um, so
Well,
that's
may I make a point here about office politics, Cameron?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, here, let's make a point about office politics. Politics, and by the way, I'm talking small p politics. I know this is a big P politics podcast, but in the small p politics exists everywhere all of the time. There's politics in your family, there's politics in your neighborhood, there's politics at the grocery store. Politics is just another word for how we navigate interpersonal relationships with each other. And again, if we don't have clarity, if we're consumed with anxiety or stress, if the rat or the chipmunk or the rabbit or whatever rodent it is that's running around in our heads just won't shut up, well, guess what? We can't get clarity. And so we have to intentionally, and this is where we get into leadership, but we have to intentionally get a hold of that part of our minds, the very ancient part of our minds that's actually running stuff, and really tell it to be quiet with the younger, more rational parts of our minds.
No, I can see that. I can see that. I yeah, that's so I'm autistic, and speaking as someone with that, there's kind of no situation in which we don't have a little bit of anxiety and a little bit of stress due to the constant rejection by people and all this type of thing. And all this in my thinking and in the way a lot of other people think, it just this whole process just doesn't make any sense in terms of, you know, I've heard people literally say, well, why do you go to work to actually get work done? And I'm like, well, that's what we're here for. If I didn't intend to get anything done, I would have stayed home.
Right.
But I've found out through other people that it really is like the mastery of being successful has nothing to do with with how good your work is. It has everything to do with interpersonal relationships. And which is I think why autistic people have an 80% unemployment rate, because that's not exactly our forte.
Well, let me give some hope to the autistic folks among you. It's interesting that you bring this up. I was listening to a podcast interview yesterday with a fellow named Ian Gilchrist. You can go look him up. He's a neurophysiologist who has done a ton of work in the space of neurobiology and
Mm.
philosophy and psychology. And he talks about extensively how, in essence, the left brain and the right brain have to work together. And in general, in autistic folks, the left brain is, in essence, overworking or overpowering the right brain. And the right brain is where all that interpersonal relationship stuff exists in general. And again, there are going to be people out there who are going to know way more about this than I am. And then I do. You can send me all of your don't bother Cameron. Send me all of your emails about how I'm wrong about this. But in general, what Ian says is the right brain is consumed with the interpersonal relationship pieces and trying to see the world as a holistic whole. Whereas the left brain is very much focused on, as you even said in your own statement there, focused on the particulars of a very narrow band of specifics, right? So think about it this way: the right brain looks at the tree and sees the entire tree in its entire existence, whereas the left brain sees the leaf on the tree and the details of the leaf on the tree and is narrowly focused on that. And so sometimes what happens with sometimes the best thing for autistic folks in going into a space where maybe their left brain is a little bit more powerful in that space than their right brain is really just having the understanding that interpersonal relationships are mostly in that creative, intuitive space, and sometimes patience and listening is going to be the thing that will walk you through. And you see this, interestingly enough, in women who have been diagnosed with Asperger's, right? And so it's a very tricky diagnosis to get to that with women, but they also suffer from the same left brain, right brain dichotomy that other folks do as well in that space. So this is just some new information that I popped on yesterday. I'm giving you a new insight. I have not had a chance to look into it, and as I said before, if I'm absolutely dead wrong, don't bother Cameron. Send me an email. You can yell at me. Don't bother Cameron. He just brought me on.
Yes. No, I wouldn't say you're too I wouldn't say you're too far off on that. I definitely kind of get that and understand that. The other thing that I think is interesting, and then you would be the person to talk to about this. Why is it that people are so afraid of threatened by people who are either very intelligent or very good at what they do? Because by the way the system is explained, people who do really good work and really get a lot of stuff done should be the ones that excel. However, they tend not to. We've always been in that situation where the backbone of the organization is someone at the bottom, and people manage to fail upward. They do badly, but then keep getting promoted. What? How? Why? That makes no logical sense in any known universe except this one, apparently.
Right. Yes, as well, Voltaire once infamously quipped that if we were living in the best of all possible universes, and this is the best of all possible worlds and the best of all possible universes, and I'm going to paraphrase here, then boy are we in trouble. Um, but that aside, the reason why people fail upward is because there are two different types of competencies. So there are technical competencies where 1+1 has to equal 2 every single time, no matter how you feel about it. And that's one whole set of competencies. And in the Industrial Revolution, in the course of the last, I would say, 120 years, from about the 1860s, the 1880s in America, about the 1860s, 1840s in England, and then the 1880s in America, all the way up to, gosh, I would assert the end of the 1990s in the world. The Industrial Revolution, in general, prioritized work that favored competency in technical matters. What happened when the internet popped up in the 1990s and we got better working computers with better working algorithms that were able to take all of that technical competency work off of the table and outsource it to machines that could do it better, faster, and easier, or in the case of globalization, outsource it to lower cost providers all across the world. Case in point, virtual assistants in the Philippines, right? If you could do that technical labor, that can be outsourced either to an algorithm or to a lower cost provider somewhere else in the world. So in the United States, what happened was we are in the process right now of I would assert a 50-year long, we're about halfway through a 50-year long shift away from technical competency and towards, and I'm going to use a couple of touchy-feely words here, but I want you to bear with me as you're listening. We're shifting towards emotional and relationship competency. Emotional and relationship competency has little or nothing to do with logic, and it has everything to do with that right brain stuff around intuition and creativity. But that's a really hard sell to people who have lived and grown up in and have benefited from, let's be blunt, the advances that technical competency has given us in the United States and in the rest of the West. And this is what's throwing everybody for a loop right now. And you even see it, I would assert, in your podcast, Cameron, or your media brand, right? I see it in my podcast. The issue of how to make a podcast popular has absolutely nothing to do with gaming. Well, I won't say nothing. It has very minimal to do with gaming the algorithm. And if you're really doing it genuinely, has everything to do with having interesting relationship driven conversations with people that are going to build relationships with your audience. And that is an unknowable, unquantifiable act that requires creativity and intuition. And that's a real struggle for folks and requires a different set of competencies. And so that's where leadership really lives. Leadership lives at the intersection between those two competencies, because I assert that you need both of those in order to be successful, rather than going to one extreme, which we did during the Industrial Revolution, or careening to the other end on the other extreme, which I unfortunately see us doing in many places right now in the Western world.
Yes, well, I totally that I mean that's absolutely fascinating. I hadn't thought about that shift from a technical expertise to a relational expertise. However, my first thought is autistic people will never be employed ever again. Like um
No, actually, I don't believe that. What I believe is that because you're always going to need a human being to make a decision, right? At the end of the day, the decision making algorithms that we have, while they are good, and don't get me wrong, quantum computers and AI is going to be amazing, at the end of the day, you still need a human being. And so while the number of technical jobs where human beings deal with other human beings will explode over the next 50 to 100 years, the number of jobs where human beings need to be technical geniuses will actually shrink. And what that means is the number of people who are autistic, who can be in that space and who can do that work at a level of competence that the other more right brain relationship oriented people can't do, they will be able to demand higher salaries. They will actually make more money, and there will be more opportunities for them rather than less.
hmm, that's an interesting concept and interesting idea.
Well,
Yeah.
it's a hopeful one. I hope it does give you some hope
Yeah.
for the future at least. And look, as that technical competency becomes more esoteric and it becomes deeper and it requires more of an understanding of the technical world that other folks are leaving behind, the opportunities for people who are willing to do that work or who are already hardwired in that direction and what they will be able to demand and negotiate is just going to be amazing.
No, certainly I can see that. I can see that. So when it comes to teams and talent development and all this type of thing, there's been so much ink spilled, or rather ones and zeros spilled, on team leading and developing your talent and all this type of thing. What's your perspective? Give us a couple best practices for making your team everything it can be.
So I recently wrote a book, and it's my most recent book that's out, and I'll just do a brief plug here. It's called 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership, co-written with contributions from my co-writer, Bradley Madigan. You can get it on Amazon, Barnes& and Noble. It's out there as a Kindle book. You could find it everywhere. In this book, I talk about the 12 areas that I believe every leader should know something about. And one of those areas is the area of team building. We also talk about conflict, dealing with difficult teams and difficult people. We talk about persuasion and accountability. We also talk about compassion fatigue and how to adapt to change. And the chapter in my book that addresses team building is chapter 5, or rule number 5. Leaders cannot always build a Maserati out of Toyota parts. And so the thoughts that I have on team building are multifaceted, but the biggest one is this, and it's really very simple. Leaders have to know their people. You cannot build an effective team if you don't know your people. And by knowing your people, here's what I mean. If I am leading Cameron, I have to know that Cameron cares about XYZ thing or ABC thing. I have to know who Cameron is as a person. And as a matter of fact, if I was once a leader of a team of 25 people, and now because of automation and algorithms and remote work and hybrid and video conferencing tools, if now I've gone from a team of 25 to a team of 10, it's actually more important for me to know who Cameron is rather than less important. I actually have to make more of an effort to build a relationship with Cameron. I actually have to make more of an effort to figure out what Cameron likes and who Cameron is. Now, if Cameron doesn't want to give me any of that, that's one thing. But if Cameron doesn't want to give me any of that after I've already done the outreach efforts, that's a totally different thing. And mostly what I see from leaders is, unfortunately, positional leaders, supervisors, and managers, I see very little effort to actually go and learn who their employees are, learn who their team members are. So you wanted some tips here on how to navigate that. Here's the biggest one. What leaders do, and this is at the end of my chapter, again, in my book, 12 Rules for Leaders, Rule 5. Number one, go to work with the team you have, not the team you want to have. The people you've got are the people you've got. Stop complaining about your people. You can develop them. You can hold them accountable. You can challenge them. You can give them more responsibility. But the people you have are the people you have. Tip number 2, be honest and forthright with your leaders, the people who are leading you, right, about the limitations of your team. Many times, managers and supervisors are so scared because of the politics at work, or because they don't want to lose their job, or because they feel like they're hanging on by a thread, or they just don't like their own boss. They're scared to be honest about the limitations of the team. They're scared to say, no, our team can't do this, or no, our team isn't prepared, or no, we haven't been trained enough. Excellent leaders, linchpin leaders, they say no, and they actually stand up for their team against the hierarchy. They advocate for their team against the hierarchy. Number 3, you have to know where your team is in the development cycle. So every team has a cycle of development. It's this whole idea of forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning, right? You have to know where your people are inside of the team development cycle. And when you bring new members in, you're creating a new developmental environment. So this is a constant chaotic churn. And the leaders who decide that they are comfortable with the churn are the leaders who succeed in developing the team. So that's not ones and zeros, that's just reality. And we wrote this book after training and developing over 15,000 managers and supervisors across multiple verticals over the course of the last 10 years. And we've seen this work.
No, that's fascinating. That's actionable. Actually, people are walking away from good value today. They've gotten several actionable things that they can take with them today. So you've done well, sir.
Oh, well, thank
That's very, no, that's very nice. It's very good. I appreciate that. What is it about? What is it about people, particularly in like smaller office environments, that always makes it so difficult? Like I feel like in a larger organization, you can kind of hide out a little bit, and there's kind of a lot more room for diversity and thinking different ways and all this type of thing. But it seems like in small office environments, you either have to be lockstep with everybody or you're out. What's that about?
So think about it in terms of, I want you to think about this in terms of the difference between a, a tribe and a nation state. So if you're in a tribe, and I am using that term on purpose, if you're in a tribe, right? If you're a small band or a member of a small band of people, let's say 20 or 30 people, all of the relationships inside of that tribe matter. And social psychology, clinical psychology, neuropsychology, philosophy, literature, base culture basically repeats over and over again to us that the relationships inside of a small group matter more than whatever the goal is the small group is pursuing, even if that small group is survival. We see this with monkeys when you go and look at not only monkeys but orangutans, baboons, any of the higher order primates. You see this reflected, and so the smaller bands of higher order primates, the relationships are hugely important, and you have a lot of grooming, you have a lot of chittering and chattering, you have a lot of food sharing. Basically, the exact same thing that happens in a small office among the highest order primates, human beings. But then human beings have done what all of the other primates have not done on the face of the planet. We've actually gone to scale. And what that means is we've taken all of the good parts about being in a tribe and we've said, hey, wouldn't it be better if this were just bigger? And then you scale up from a tribe to a neighborhood, from a neighborhood to a city, from a city to a state, and then from a state to a nation state. And the larger the organization becomes, the weaker the ties. This is the concept of weak ties versus strong ties. The weaker the ties become between individuals. And as those ties weaken, my level of emotional engagement with somebody else inside of that larger nation state becomes less important. So, for instance, I live in Texas. Texas is a big state. And the place where I live in Texas is close to, I'll kind of give you an idea of just geographically. We're close to the north, where I am, is close to the northeastern border of Texas. So when the tragic school shooting happened at the Uvalde school down in San Antonio, my sister called me, who lives in another state, and she said, hey, are your kids okay? And I said, San Antonio's 4.5 hours from me. It's tragic, and it's far away from me. So I can have emotion about that tragedy. I can advocate for or against gun control around that tragedy, right? But it's still 4 hours away from me. Those are people I don't have a relationship with. And I'm using that as an example for what happens at a proxy for what happens in between human beings in interpersonal relationships. There's a very simple way to think about this. It's called Dunbar's number. So back in the day, there was a guy named Dunbar who did some research, and what he found out was the average human being can only keep track of around 150 different relational ties. That's it. Anything past that pushes our upper limit of cognition. And that's why in a smaller office, it seems as though the conflicts are much more bitter. It seems as though everything matters more. It's because those relational ties are so much stronger, even if we don't want to be. Even if we don't want them to be. Whereas in a much larger organization, like say an AT&T or a John Deere or a Google, which has employs something like I think 30,000 people, please, you can go in there and you can hide all day because no one's paying attention to you. It's an issue of scale. It's an issue of numbers. And it's an issue of human cognition and what we can handle in terms of interpersonal relationships.
No, that that surmises it very well. I think that makes a lot of sense. I've spent most of my time working with small and medium-sized businesses, and I've had to sit down with the married couple who owns the shop or the restaurant, and usually in that situation you have to convince the wife.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And then I've also, worked in these small offices where it just seems like everything's gone wrong. I'm just kind of become a non-starter from the beginning, which is why I do this. And I find your career so fascinating that you're able to navigate in these places and spaces and all this type of thing. The listener will not know this because we're audio only today, but how has being a person of color affected this whole journey for you?
So that's a great question, Cameron. And I'll be honest with you. And this is going to be a little bit counterintuitive, probably, maybe to just some of your listeners and maybe even to you. But it's also going to be something that's going to reveal, and my answer is going to be something that is going to reveal a little bit about sort of how I perceive my place in the world and how I perceive my position in relation to other folks. So one of the ideals that I was raised with, and my mom is a lawyer, and she worked for the federal government for many years, and my father was a blue collar guy, and then they got divorced, and my mother remarried, and my stepfather's even more of a blue collar guy. And so I was raised in a very much in an intellectual and hard work environment, with the idea that you're just going to do twice as much to get half as much, and that's not something that you should complain about. It's just something you should sort of walk through with a sense of dignity, and a sense of sort of a George, sort of a Booker T. Washington kind of dignity, right? You're going to walk through it in this kind of way, because what is complaining really going to get for you? Obviously, when there's injustice, you should say something about it, but very often, life is going to be unjust. So you really have to keep your powder dry when you go and face injustice. Okay. So I was raised with this kind of concept, right? And this was floating around for many years inside of my head, sort of unexamined, and went through life, and then went through my conflict management program at Abilene Christian University, became a divorce and family mediator. I worked for many years in higher education, and then, of course, began to develop my consultancy and developed the leadership training and development side of the business, and now I'm into publishing. And being a person who happens, and it is a quirk of fate, who happens to have a skin tone that's darker than other folks, has never been for me something that I have found to be, or a space that I have found to be a stumbling block, because I think that that's other people's problems, not mine. And one of the things that I learned very early on in my career was I can't own other people's problems. I can't own other people's situations. I can't own other people's dynamics. Instead, what I can do is own my dynamics and figure out how to navigate those dynamics in a world that might be inherently unfair. Now, I can already hear the pushback on this, right? Well, what about the institutionalization of unfairness? Or what about the institutionalization of racism? Or shouldn't we be taking our experience and building a more socially just world? And it's interesting because in answer to that pushback, I will say that very often in our consultancy, well, I shouldn't say very often, over the last few years, we've gotten more and more calls for people from organizations who want to work with us in the DE and I space, and we refer those out. I tend not to take on that work, and my consultancy tends not to take on that work. Not because I don't think it's valuable, but because I think what we are doing is we are attempting to solve problems of identity that are individualistic with corporate means. And I don't think we can do that effectively. I think that the way we solve those identity problems is through relationship. I think that the way we solve those kind of problems is through challenging institutions at a relational level, not necessarily a policy or personnel level. Because you could switch faces around, but that doesn't change people's hearts. And I know there will be pushback on that. I know people will listen to that and they'll say, well, you're just naive, or you haven't lived long enough, or you're too sheltered, or you have too high an education. And maybe that might be so. I'll give the devil his due. But again, all of that doesn't, none of that negates anything or my posture towards the world that I've taken. And so it's just a critique. It's not a negation, it's a critique. And it's an interesting one, but it doesn't stop me from putting one foot in front of the other and pursuing goals, pursuing opportunities, and pursuing the path, even though it may be narrow, pursuing the path with hope and joy and optimism and a sense that tomorrow will be better than today. And that's, I think, how we win those victories. So when I go into a space and someone tells me, and actually this did happen, someone tells me, walks up to me and says to me, hey, San, this is all great information that you gave us about leadership or conflict or dealing with difficult people or handling accountability. This is all great stuff, but what do we do with this? Because my boss doesn't care about any of this. Which was the title of my second book, by the way. My Boss Doesn't Care: 100 Essays on Disrupting Your Workplace by Disrupting Your Boss. That person who's asking me that question in that moment isn't looking at me through a racial lens. At least not exclusively anyway. They're looking at me as a professional, as a person who is coming in to deliver a solution to their problem. And that's how I approach every interaction that I have, regardless of how that other person is showing up in the space.
I will say that does sound a bit Pollyanna to me.
I know.
As yes, as someone, I mean, as someone who's been on the other side, to where people take one look at me and they're like, "You're a giant 6 foot football player looking dude." For most people, that's just a non-starter. That's why I quit marketing consulting and started doing the Cameron Journal full time. It was a non-starter, mostly because I found white people did not want to see a large brown fellow tell them what they were doing wrong. That was just out of the natural order of things. And and it's funny because when I figured that out, and when someone kind of put it together for me, because I didn't put it together, because I felt similarly to be kind of like, I do good work, I have all this experience, I have built brands from an idea to a thing and made it popular and all this type of thing, and people want that. They're not going to care what package it comes in. They just want the result. And when someone finally put it together to me, and she told me at the time, she's like, people expect you to play football and not much else. And so they don't want you to walk up in and tell them that their marketing has gone wrong or their branding needs help or they need to completely report it. That's not your lane. You can play football, you can be a bouncer at the club, you can be somebody's bodyguard, that's about it. And it was good to figure that out because I was just about to try to really, expand consulting again. And so I abandoned the idea entirely. And
well,
yeah, and that was a very hard thing to do because I liked it and it paid better.
Well, but you know what? At the end of the day, though, that may be, and again, this may be my Pollyanna showing, at the end of the day, that opened up the capability for you to use the talents and skills that you have acquired hard acquired, right? They weren't easy to acquire, that you've acquired over the course of time to be able to A, build a brand, B, reach listeners, and C, have a global reach that is far bigger and far broader than I would suspect you ever would have gotten just working with one brand at a time to solve their marketing problem. And by the way, marketers ruin everything. And I'm not saying you're ruining everything. I'm just saying, that's the old idea, right? That marketers ruin everything.
I wouldn't disagree with you on that. No, we bring up all sorts of problems and issues and things that just make everyone mad at us. And, right. Or we really want this, or this is what worked well, we need more of that. And especially technical people are just kind of like, please go away. Far away from here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so you're taking those skills, right, of discovering where there is a problem, figuring out a solution to that problem, and then targeting content towards that solution that is engaging, that's interesting, that's invigorating, and that gets people's attention and awareness and that provides value. I can't think of a better way, a more uplifting way, a more epic journey to set your foot upon. And so, again, maybe this is me looking at it in a Pollyannish way, but potential, not but, and potentially that individual who gave you that feedback released you from something that was not working. That way you could be released into something that would work better. I don't know. Your mileage and my mileage will vary. We're both individuals rather than a collective, right? And so I think the individualization of our experience is hugely important for success. So I applaud you. I applaud you for hearing that feedback and taking it and doing something with it.
That, well, I mean, yeah, it was kind of a very it was very necessary. It was a wake up call to kind of understand, like, that's the problem. To be kind of like, okay, because you're right. I mean, it was very hard. It was a struggle. I was in a lot of, really kind of awful situations that I, probably should have gotten out of, but didn't because of the opportunity, or in a lot of cases, there just wasn't anything left. There wasn't anything else. So I think your intuition in that situation is quite spot on, and that's why I think it's so exciting that you've gotten to be able to do what you do, and you've given us all these wonderful insights and all this type of thing. I just think that's spectacular, and I'm always impressed when I see someone doing something that I would either like to do or would have liked to have done or whatever have you. So it's just been fascinating.
Well, and let me add another layer onto this. I'm also stubborn and bullheaded, right? And so that stubbornness, that bullheadedness, that sense of no, that sense of no really lives inside of me, right? So I'm an intellectually sharp and sometimes highly resistant person. And that's a deadly combination. That's a deadly combination in a negotiation. That's a deadly combination in a confrontation. That's a deadly combination in a dispute or in a disagreement. But that's also a deadly combination in what I do. And so I can be convinced of a particular viewpoint that is the opposite of mine. I can be persuaded into thinking something else. But I was also raised to be skeptical. I was raised to say no. I was raised to say, okay, these are two sides of an argument, but we know for a fact that there's probably 35,000 permutations outside of those two sides. And who has license to the truth here? Who gets to say that this is the reality? And by the way, who gave them the authority? I love that one too. Who made you in charge? Right? And so, I've been in rooms in training rooms with CEOs and senior leadership teams where CEOs will try to take over the room or try to take over the training. And I've been very polite, but I've been very direct. And I've said, no, this is my room. I own it now.
No, I've definitely been in that situation, um, both in, different spaces trying to work with different people who are just kind of like, who is this guy and where did he come from? And then also in nightlife and fashion and all this type of thing, and trying to, get people all moving in the same direction. And it requires a self-confidence and a surety that I think is it's what separates the leaders from the sheep, really, to put it in Joe Rogan terms. Really, I mean, that's what I mean. If you know how to, own the space you occupy and command it and redirect people's energy and all this type of thing, that's that will be a very valuable asset. And not everyone has that. Most people like to follow along, don't like to keep their head up, all this type of thing. So if you can do that, that's something. Really, that's something.
Well, it also requires a giant dollop of clarity, going back to those three C's, right? That we started
Yes.
our at the top of our podcast with, right? So many people don't know what's on offer in any kind of negotiation or any type of conversation because they don't have clarity on what they want, but they also don't have clarity on what the other party wants. And when the other party has no clarity, That's one thing. But when you have clarity, when you have the ability to say, this is the very narrow thing that I want. Remember, I was talking about the left brain, right brain thing. This is the left brain, very narrow, very specific thing that I want out of this interaction. Or alternatively, this is the broad, holistic, right brain, all encompassing thing that I want out of this interaction. And then you have the ability to intentionally and purposefully, and in some cases I would even say ruthlessly, but intentionally and purposefully pursue that. That's where you win. And I don't think that that's beyond the capability of anybody. I think everybody has that unique power in their hands. It's just not everybody believes that they do. And that's a huge stumbling block, because beliefs create mental models, and mental models then create reality very often.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, we're reaching the top of the hour, so now is the time to let us know where we can find you online, how to interact with you, and how to keep up with you after this is over.
Absolutely. Well, first off, once again, thank you, Cameron, for inviting me on your show. Thank you for inviting me on your platform. We had a great conversation here. You raised a number of great questions, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to your listeners about the world, not only of leadership, but also of conflict, interpersonal communication, the right brain and the left brain, and of course, giving you actionable tips and value. If you would like to connect with me, if you would like to connect with HSCT Publishing, or if you would like to connect with any of our products, either Leading Keys or Leadership Toolbox for your organization, or if you'd like to have myself or any one of my team members come into your organization and work with you in a consulting, training, or development capacity, you can always reach out to me directly on LinkedIn. You just type my name in, JesanSorrells, so you can catch me on LinkedIn. You can check out the HSCT Publishing page on Facebook. We also have a corporate page on LinkedIn. And of course, you can go and check out our websites for our products, leadershiptoolbox.us or leadingkeys.com. Now, Leading Keys is our platform service. Leadership Toolbox is our remote training and development service, where we come in and work with your organization remotely via Zoom, Cisco WebEx, Microsoft Teams, whatever you got. And we also provide customized training and development solutions to begin the process of intentionally developing your leaders today. Now, I do have my own podcast. Actually, I got a couple of them. If you'd like to hear more insights from me, you could check out the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, where we read a great book of literature, and you take that great book of literature or a great paper of literature, and we talk about what are the insights that leaders can gain from reading that book. Most recently, we've read Sun Tzu's The Art of War. We've read the American Nation-State Papers, the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, and the Declaration of Independence. And of course, we've read The Unbearable Lightness of Being by Milan Kundera. Go and check that podcast out on any of the major podcast players, where you will also be listening to this podcast. Finally, if you want to contact me directly because, well, heck, you want to correct me on something that I said on the show, you can always feel free to email me, CEO@hsconsultingandtraining.com. That's CEO@hsconsultingandtraining.com. Thank you very much, Cameron.
And thank you for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast. I appreciate it. That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter. And we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.